Back at it again, diving into the numbers. This week, we're going to be covering the inflation rate of Canada and the inflation rate of Great Britain. And then we'll talk about Japan's trade deficit numbers that came out that are also a little bit disappointing for Japan. So just going straight into Canada, Canada's inflation numbers seem to be going in quite a good direction for Canada. Headline inflation was 2.7%, and the core inflation was 1.6%. So there we see core inflation at a nice level, I guess, within their target or below their target of 2%. But headline inflation is still a bit above, but again, working its way closer to the desired result, even though the Bank of Canada came out and said they still expect it for the first half of the year to still be around that 3% and won't move, closer to 2.5% until the end of the year. Do you have anything that you saw there that was interesting that kind of stood out to you?
I think it was quite a relief for investors, especially after the inflation figures that came out from the US, which we discussed last week. So having after the inflation numbers in the United States of America, Canada coming out a couple of days later with also encouraging numbers, I think that is a good sign. And we will see where this leads to in regards to the interest rates. We have seen that the markets have reacted very positively. Whether this will be a sustainable development or whether there will be more challenges along the way will still to be seen. What we have to be cautious about is also that as more we move into the year, we also see the base effect or the basis effect coming in more and more, because towards the second part of the last year of 2023, inflation started to decrease or decelerate, correct? Yeah. And so we will see what kind of effect this has on the inflation numbers. Another interesting part on the inflation in Canada was also that oil prices, they have increased due to what is going on in the Middle East, due to like insecurity. And so this had a negative effect on inflation, so that it stays higher in April than it was the month before.
In the UK or Great Britain, we saw inflation at headline inflation was down to 2.3%, and core inflation was at 3.9%. Now, we did see some easing, certainly, year on year for the numbers in April. But what is still the serious issue that I see in the UK is they disappointed forecasters. They were expecting 2.1%. And at the same time, a lot of that huge cut was for gas and heating for housing that the UK government essentially price capped in April. And so it saw this huge decrease, but it's through serious government intervention into almost price fixing, or I guess essentially price freezing, so that there's a certain limit to how much these energy companies can produce or make, and so that's going to have a massive impact on inflation.
It's also interesting. I mean, this year there is an election coming up in the UK, and so you see how these numbers are like interpreted in a different way. So the Tories, who are currently in power, they say, "Oh, that's such a great sign. Look what we have achieved." And I mean, indeed, when they took over office, the inflation number was about 11.1%. Yeah. So it is a huge decrease. But then on the other hand, you have the Labour Party, which is like, yeah, you see, it's not as good as people expected or as economists expected. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you look over a longer period, not only like this year, I mean, the price increases, especially like in food and beverage, I mean, over the years, it has been more than 20 up to 30%. So there is definitely a heavy weight being on the population, how to deal with this higher cost. And yeah, you can cut or you can cap prices on a certain good or service for a certain amount of time. But the question already is how healthy is it for the economy in the long term?
Yeah, and there were price, I guess, freezes that we've seen throughout history. A very common one was when Richard Nixon put a price freeze on the price of gold.
Yeah.
And essentially tanked everything. Now that was a huge asset that they put the price freeze on, but so is the heating gases needed for homes.
Yeah.
And you get to see this picture of where the governments have certain, I guess, levers of influence on the economy, and each economy is a bit different, to help push the numbers in the right direction, despite maybe the population still feeling the heavy tolls of what the UK economy has been, especially in the inflationary environment. And so, where this number seems to be going in the right direction, you still have core inflation at nearly 4%, which is way too high. And I mean, it provides a challenging environment, because even though it's going lower, is it still giving enough of a sign to say, okay, let's maybe move interest rates, let's move some of these other levers that might make it a little bit easy for the companies to exist? I mean, these gas companies are price capped, so what's the long-term proposition for them?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the challenging issue that you see is, yeah, you can make things look good, but will the players making up the economy be able to sustain with those levers being used?
Yeah, from my perspective, like a figure which I like, or yeah, I would say so, is like the consumer sentiment, which I think is much more important than like all these other numbers, because like a person who is like going to work every day and living is her life. I mean, people usually don't follow as closely the inflation figures that come out, but they have a certain sentiment, they have a certain feeling when they go to the shop and see, okay, milk is up another 5%. That is what frustrates them. And so I think the consumer sentiment, from my perspective, is at least as important as the inflation numbers.
Absolutely. I think it's very important. So we don't want to get lost too much there, because we need to move on to Japan.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of signs there. So covering the Japan's trade deficit, it's quite interesting to see. We talked last week about the struggles that Japan is dealing with. Again, we see some more struggles coming in, despite seeing growth in their exports of about 8.3%, and imports was also at 8.3%. But in terms of exports, economists were expecting about 11.1% of increase, and they didn't see that, and that's left them with increasing their trade deficit even further.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, I mean, it goes in the same direction as like the growth of Japan in the first quarter. There has been some struggles with one company which is owned by Toyota. They had some issues, and so they couldn't export as much as they wanted to. So this definitely had an impact. But I mean, at the end of the day, it seems like that everything comes together at the moment and speaks against Japan. But as I also like mentioned in the past, is I mean, once you're at such a point, there is a lot of room to improve, to get out of it. And I think that Japan is on a good stage to come out of such a difficult period and prove the world that they are still competitive, that they are still able to manage themselves as an economy, as a successful economy.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the often missing pieces when looking at the environment, whether it be the investment markets, a company, the economy in general. When you hit a hard spot, you can see it, or people can see it as total failure, get rid of them. Or they can say, okay, how are we going to overcome this?
Yeah.
And that's what I really appreciate about hard spots. Yes, it's tough. Yes, it's challenging. But will there be brave participants, whether they be companies, individuals, authorities, that are going to be brave and see some, I guess, not necessarily innovation, but how are they going to work their way out of the hard spot? And that can prove a lot of resilience and really set you up for a long, sustainable future when you really learn from these challenges. So next week, we will be covering the German consumer sentiment, as we had mentioned. We will also be covering the unemployment rate of the Euro area, and I believe inflation numbers of Germany as well.
Yes, correct.